So
Yes.
let's go ahead and get started. If Julie, you ready?
Yes, I am.
All right, Michela, you ready? Let's go ahead. Very good.
And
Hello,
Johnny,
everyone. I'm Ken Knickerbocker. Welcome to NoonZOOM. I'm owner of American Community Journals and publisher of Vista, Montco, Delco, and Bucksco Today. As we mentioned last week, each one of these platforms, the mission is to celebrate the community, whether it's a business community, the cultural community, or the community itself. We want to celebrate it each and every day. Today's NoonZOOM could well be titled Out Damn Bug. We all are aware of the spotted lanternfly and the impact it has on our own activities, whether it's in our backyard or whether it's eating out at a restaurant. They're terrible flyers. They can hop, they fly a little bit and then they land on us. They're a nuisance and they're a distraction. That's to us personally, as they invade our personal space. But the real impact in Pennsylvania is not to us per se, but the industries, specifically the agricultural industry, the ornamental plants, the lumber, the orchards and the fruit trees, and specifically grapes and vineyards. There's 250 some wineries across the state, and as a portion of the $18 billion agriculture industry, that's what the real impact of the lanternfly has been on Pennsylvania. Today with us to talk about the lanternfly and its economic impact are two professors and researchers from Penn State, Julie Urban and Michela Centinari. Did I get that right? I was close enough. Okay.
Yes, close enough.
All right,
Centinari.
very good. So what they are going to talk about, and Julie, I'll turn the time over to you in just a moment, is where the spotted lanternfly came from, how it got here, and what we're doing about it. But it's the impact on the state economy and what role Penn State is doing, not only to understand the lanternfly, but to eventually eradicate it, or at the very least control it so it doesn't spread as far. But Julie, before I turn the time over to you, one housekeeping item.
Yes.
Throughout the presentation, you'll have questions. We're going to save the questions to the end of the presentation, but I would ask that you use the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen as opposed to the chat. Use the Q&A box at the bottom to field questions. John Durso and I will be watching the questions as they come in, and at appropriate times during the presentation, as well as after during the Q&A session, John or I will field the question and get Michela or Julie's feedback.
Great.
So with that, Julie, I'll turn the time over to you and take it away.
Oh, I just froze.
So, hey, quick question for you. Do you remember the moment in time when you first heard of the spotted lanternfly? And when did you know that it was going to be an oh no kind of thing, that this was more than just a bug?
Yes. Well, actually, my specialization is this studying this particular family of plant hoppers. So I've known about spotted lanternfly since I started my graduate work, and I was very aware of it once when it being a pest in South Korea. And so an adult was actually intercepted and given to me for DNA analysis in 2009.
Wow.
And then I was working at the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences in 2014, and I got a call from a guy who I actually knew from graduate school, who also studied plant hoppers, and he was one of the people who first detected it. And he said, "Hi, Julie, this is so-and-so. Call me back. This is confidential." And I knew right then lanternfly was here. And when I knew it was a no moment, I'll tell you in a second, because that was a different thing. That first experience was kind of like if you like travel extensively to try to study penguins, and then suddenly you learn your backyard is filled with penguins.
Yeah.
Your first reaction is real excitement. And then when you see the penguins and what they do, then you're like, oh no. And I'll tell you when I got to that oh no moment. Okay, so let's start with lanternflies. Lanternfly is a plant hopper. There's over 14,000 described species of plant hoppers. Many are tiny, and they're notorious pests of cereal crops. Lanternfly is really unusual among plant hoppers, but what they all have in common is they're sap feeding insects. So their business parts here that we're worried about are their mouth parts. They have this straw-like beak, and it lays along their abdomen. And what they do is they insert it into plants. You can see a lanternfly feeding right there. And there's actually tiny little hair-like stylets that are enclosed within those mouth parts that penetrate the plant tissue and kind of do all the damage, but feed on the sap. And so that's why they're a problem. And we'll talk about that in more detail. But there's, as I mentioned, there's over 14,000 different species of lanternflies in 14 different families. Lanternfly is one particular family. And so what's interesting here is that as a group of sap feeders, any kind of insect that feeds on sap typically lays its eggs where the offspring can feed. And so, the offspring hatch out. They don't have wings, they can't fly around, they tend to not be mobile for most insects. And so eggs tend to get laid on viable host plants. Well, lanternflies, not just our lanternfly, but other species in the tropics even, they didn't read the literature. They lay their eggs on essentially anything. They lay them on even human-made substrates. And so here you can see lanternfly egg masses that are laid on stone. Certainly offspring can't feed on stone, but if you have lanternfly in your backyard, you'll notice that they're incredibly mobile. Even without wings, they book around everywhere. And so you can see that those egg masses are often really hard to detect. Sometimes they're not covered with that mass and they blend right in. And so based on where lanternfly was first detected in 2014, kind of our ground zero, and talking with people who worked in that area, we're pretty sure that lanternfly got here in that egg mass stage. Those egg masses were laid on a pallet or on a shipment of stone, either on the pallet itself or on the actual stone that we believe was imported from China. They received shipments from various regions in China.
And they first showed up in Berks County, right?
Yep, in Berks County, and they were first detected on September 22nd, 2014. But based on interviews that USDA and Pennsylvania Department of Ag did with folks around, who worked in that area, and their finding of old egg masses, it was there at least 2 years prior to that and just wasn't detected.
Mm-hmm.
And so lanternfly feeds on the new literature lists keep increasing, but it's on over 100 different species of plants and trees. And even if one of its preferred hosts is an introduced invasive tree of heaven or Ailanthus altissima. And so what's interesting is that even if it has tree of heaven available to it, it'll still move on and off of it. It'll feed really broadly on a lot of things, but that it feeds so heavily on tree of heaven or likes it so much is part of the problem, because tree of heaven, if you cut it down, that's not sufficient to kill it. You need to pour in an herbicide and kill the plant tissue. And so you can see down here these little green, we call them candy canes, they're little sprouts that'll sprout out from tree of heaven. And you can see these insects are still even feeding on this cut down trunk. And because tree of heaven feeds so much or grows so much in heavily disturbed areas along rail lines and highway corridors, it essentially has set the stage to allow lanternfly to spread almost throughout the country. And so when it was first detected in 2014, within 2 weeks, the USDA put together a scientific advisory panel, and I was on that. So by the beginning of October in 2014, I was working in North Carolina. There were a number of us from around the country and from overseas who were advising Pennsylvania Department of Ag and USDA, and they put just these, basically they were townships all in Berks County under quarantine. And as it spread just the next few years, you can see that more townships, came under quarantine. And then in 2017, this really expanded. They took it to a county level. But in 2017, the answer to your question, Ken, this is when I knew it was going to be an oh no moment, was back in March. And I had a student I was co-advising with a faculty member who is a grape entomologist in my department, Mike Saunders. And we were in a pickup truck with a grower scoping out where in his field we would be able to test some insecticides come spring. And even though it was pouring down rain, we saw all of these lanternfly egg masses on post after post in this vineyard. And this is when my stomach dropped and I knew, oh nuts, this is going to be bad. And then that year, you can see my student took this video. You can see lanternfly feeding in really high numbers on grapes. And because they're a sap feeder, they feed on sugary sap. So they excrete sugary sap. You can see it shooting out right here where my cursor is. We call that honeydew. But that is a problem as well. If you have lanternfly in your yard, you'll notice that attracts stinging bees and wasps and flies and all sorts of other things. But also it's potentially a substrate for mold growth, which in itself can be a problem. But we were seeing these unusually high numbers in actually that same vineyard where we hadn't seen numbers in previous years. And so we knew that the populations were much, much higher. And essentially 2017 was when we had basically the Pennsylvania Senate and House had a joint hearing on it and how to respond to lanternfly. And basically it was the year before in 2016, I had the opportunity to come start work at Penn State. But here you can see we saw hugely high numbers. This is not a video that we took, but we saw thousands on individual trees, which is very alarming. But the thing that kind of really was a problem at that year was it also moved on to apple. And so I'll show you pictures of that in a minute. But since that time when it was really only in those green counties, you can see this is a map that New York State IPM keeps that shows blue areas are areas where lanternfly has established populations. So you can see that that's 34 counties within Pennsylvania. It's in all states contiguous with the US. There have also been finds of mostly dead lanternfly, but in two cases, one in California and one in Washington very recently, where live have shown up. And we see these disjunct populations kind of in Ohio and Indiana. So certainly this insect is spreading.
A minute ago, you said it was in all 5 boroughs of New York City?
Yes, all 5 boroughs. I knew it was really well established in Staten Island, but a colleague of ours who just gave a presentation was showing that it's in all 5 boroughs in New York City. And there it's actually even problematic because when they do surveys for Tree of Heaven is the tree that's described in the book. A tree grows in Brooklyn, it grows out of sidewalks. They have to do surveys on rooftops to look at Ailanthus. So I think that's going to be a hot mess next year. And so to go on here, what does lanternfly do? We did see it in high numbers in 2017 in apple, and it would come into those trees and it would feed. And that was very alarming to us, also on other tree fruit, stone fruit, nectarines and whatnot. But in that year and in every year since, they'll feed on it during late season, for about 3 weeks and then move on, and absolutely no damage has been recorded in any tree fruit, which is great. The other place, and I'll hand it off to Michela in a second to talk about impacts in grapes, but in addition to grapes, the other main industry that's reporting economic damage are nurseries. And so here's a nursery we worked with, and these trees in the background were just filled with spotted lanternfly, and the spotted lanternfly would come in and get into these topiaries. And so even though spotted lanternfly don't feed on conifers, that doesn't mean they can't get into them. And so this is a problem for selling plant stock to other states, and even within the state, we have permits that, you need a permit to move any kind of materials from lanternfly infested areas, but certainly plant materials, we don't want to send that to other states. That's certainly not good for business. So trying to change their management practices to treat more or to pack their trucks differently, we see real strong impacts in nurseries. And again, Christmas trees, they've been in front of it as a Christmas tree industry, but you can see if they lay their eggs in plant material, it's really problematic.
As we go ahead. I'm sorry, Julie.
Yeah. So, and then the other part, I mentioned the sooty mold. A longer term potential impact here that we haven't assigned any economic value to, because it's going to be a while before we see a problem, is that when lanternfly feeds and they excrete that sugary excrement, this black sooty mold grows. And you can see it almost looks like someone, set fire to the understory. And so what does this mean? They tend not to penetrate forests, but even in edge areas, Understory plants tend to be important food resources for deer and birds and other animals. And so we're concerned about those impacts long-term and what it might mean for forest regeneration, even just in those edge areas.
Now, as we switch over to Michela here, question for you. One of our attendees asked, noticed that this summer there weren't that many in the Philadelphia area, right? She lives in Fort Washington, and she said, I hardly saw any. Why was there, and that was common here in the Southeast Pennsylvania area, why were there so few this year as opposed to previous years?
Well, one thing that people hope is that there was like a knockdown in the core, that maybe the populations are collapsing, because we saw that with brown marmorated stink bug. But with brown marmorated stink bug, there's other stink bugs here that are very similar to it, that have natural enemies that kind of change their food source over and knock down the brown marmorated stink bug. We don't have anything like that. So any mechanism where that might be happening that systematically drops the populations down is most likely to be depletion of food resources. They're tapping out those trees, but that tends to be temporary. And so even though we might see drops in some areas, we're seeing increases in other areas. And so I really don't think it means that the populations are diminishing or that it's really less of a problem. It's just moving around.
So
Hey,
stay tuned.
Julie, we had another question from somebody. How long do they take to lay their eggs once they're at maturity?
That's exactly what I'm researching. A longer time than you would think, and I'll get to that with that. That might limit where they can get to.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Go ahead, Michela.
Okay, so hi everyone. Can you see my screen? Did I share? Okay. Yeah, so I'm going to briefly talk about the potential impact of lanternfly on grapes. So my specialty is wine grapes. This is what my work at Penn State. And so first, just a few key facts about the Pennsylvania wine industry. I don't know how many of you, are familiar with our PA wine industry. So as Ken mentioned, we have many wineries, over 300 wineries in Pennsylvania, and most of them are in the south central, southeast PA. So we have a lot of wineries there, a lot of wine grape production, and that is where lanternfly is established, where we have the infestations. Also briefly, I wanted to mention that the economic impact of the wine industry to the Pennsylvania wine economy is about $1.4 billion. That includes also agrotourism and jobs, etc. So it's pretty relevant as an agricultural or fruit crops. And so Julie mentioned that the lanternfly can feed on many different plants, and this is why also so successful. And unfortunately for grape growers, grapes are really one of their favorite hosts. And Julie already mentioned that we have seen lanternfly on apples, on other fruit crops, but they don't really damage those crops. They really like and prefer and stay in grapevines. They spend a lot of time. They love to feed on grapevines. And so this is the picture on your left that was taken in 2017, and that was my first, close interaction with the lanternflies. And you can see that they're really covering, the trunk of a grapevine. They really like to feed, close to the clusters, the fruit, and on the trunk of the vines. They're like everywhere. So you imagine when growers start to see this high number of this new insect on their vines, they had a lot of questions. They needed to know what type of damage they can cause, how they can affect their fruit, their wine, how they can affect the health of the vines. There were a lot of questions, and we had basically no information, very little from other countries, that had invasion of lanternfly, like South, Korea. We have really had to start from zero. Here more a picture of vineyards. So the one on the left, this is a picture was taken by Julie when we visited one of the first vineyard that had lanternfly infestation. So the picture was taken end of May 2019. And also I put as a comparison a picture on your right, which is a nearby vineyard with no lanternfly infestation. So you can see that the vineyard on the left have like zero vegetation, like zero, no shoots growing. There are only like brown trunk. So this vineyard basically was, the vine were dead, and that happened after 2 or 3 years of lanternfly infestation. This was one of the first vineyard where we see high population of lanternfly. And I don't want, to say that just the lanternfly, only the lanternfly can kill vines. We don't know that yet. There are many factors, that can hold together, kill a plant, the weather, other diseases, but definitely, there is a correlation about how many lanternfly were in this vineyard and for how long, and and the death or the decline on this vineyard. So it's again very, very concerning. So as the lanternfly expanded in more and more vineyards, throughout the year from 2017 to now, we have heard from growers about problem with their grape production. Like after 1 or 2 years of heavy infestation, they may have, decrease in productivity, their vines. Also, another big problem that, for their economic impact on this crop is the increased management cost. Grapes are already expensive, an expensive crop to grow. It's very labor intensive, and the presence of lanternfly increase really the management costs. And also when we plant, an orchard or a vineyard, this is really a long-term investment. In order to be economically sustainable, the vines needs to be productive, produce fruit for like 20 years. So if the lanternfly start, to cause the vine decline and reduce production and increase cost, that really can put, some wineries and vineyard out of business. So this is, another big concern. And a team of people from Penn State, we are actually next week, in a couple of weeks, sending out a survey to all our wineries and also in surrounding states to assess the economic impact that this pest had so far, in vineyards, but also in wineries. So we will have more information of, direct and indirect economic impact soon. So I briefly also want to mention that one of the risks from lanternfly, or one of the problems is also a nuisance to crops, but also, to people visiting wineries. Like when you go to a winery, maybe you want to enjoy, some wine, cheese, and music outdoor, and and wineries are really concerned about lanternfly, bothering customers, jumping on, on people. So they're also very concerned about bad reviews from customers. People don't go back to their business because of lanternfly. So this is another, problem that can affect their business. So briefly, I just want to mention that lanternfly, yes, they can damage the plants. They can damage, and already Julie mentioned that they can feed on the plant, on the grapevine, and they can take up a large amount of sap, which contains nutrients, sugar. So all of important things that the vines and the plants need to stay healthy, to produce grapes, and to survive over the years. They need, in order to stay healthy, they need these nutrients, this sugar. So we are really concerned that that the lanternfly can really remove a lot of sap and a lot of nutrients and sugar and compromise the vine health. Also, I want to mention that so far, what is most concerning for our grape growers are adult population, because they really fly into vineyards. We see this high number flying into vineyards late in the season, like end of August and September. And this is when, the fruit is ripening and when growers need to harvest their crop. So there are a lot of issues related to managing lanternflies during harvest, and also how manage the grapes, how control the lanternfly during a period where you cannot really spray chemicals, insecticide that can, be effective for a long time. We don't want, and we can't, of course, harm people by spraying, insecticide during this time. I mean, certain type of insecticide. So it's really challenging to manage because of the time of the year they are in vineyards. So last, I want to mention that Penn State we have been trying to help and answer so many questions that growers, have about the impact of this pest on their crops. And we do experiments, commercial commercial vineyards in the quarantine area. This is one of our sites where we, caged vines. We put, and we introduce a lanternfly inside, and we put a lot of sensors. We like to, we are scientists. We like to measure and take a lot of data and measure everything. But if I can give, just two bullet points, what we have found so far is that definitely, if the lanternfly feed on the vines for a long time, they can really reduce the vine ability or capability to produce sugar, but also can reduce the accumulation of sugar and nutrients in the vines, which really is important, again, for vine health. So, understanding the damage is important for us in order to provide a recommendation to growers on how to manage this pest. Also, Penn State has been doing, this is just a brief summary of what basically I've been saying, like when we talk to growers now, what we recommend that is to treat the lanternfly as an additional stressor that the vines needs to deal with. Other stressors are weather like drought, flooding, cold temperature, other disease. So unfortunately, this is another stressor that growers and plants need to deal with and manage. Also, Penn State has been doing a lot of work on management, options, how grape grower can manage. They've been doing some experiments and trying to do more targeted chemical control. So, to reduce the amount of pesticide that we apply on the vines, maybe target specific area where lanternfly are mostly present. And also some effort on trying to, keep the lanternfly from entering into the vineyard, right? So they will be the best if they cannot get into the vineyard. So there have been some trials like building this big barrier, like 13 feet tall wall to stop the lanternfly from going into the vineyard, but also these nets that can enclose the vineyard, like this exclusion netting to protect them from lanternfly. So this is just, some of the research that Penn State has been doing and trying to help grape growers to deal with this pest. And just had, a last slide, just to mention that, this has really been a very, very big team effort, across department, across, disciplines, because it's been, a big challenge, and we're all, working together trying to help our industry. And definitely, grape growers has been very, very helpful, and very willing to let us do research at their vineyard. This has been a big part of our work and success, I guess.
Michela, are you hopeful at this point? Are you winning the war? Are you slowing the growth? Where are you now at the end of 2021?
I think what right now we understand more of the type of damage, and we can, start to help growers to, to tell them maybe don't spray if you only have 2 or 3 lanternfly on the vines. Maybe wait until you have more lanternflies, or maybe timing better the application of chemicals. Try to help them to manage this pest. Yeah, I think at least now we know more. And by knowing more, we can help the growers, before we know like nothing about this pest.
That's a hopeful message. Julie, you had some closing slides that you wanted to share with us.
Ken, there's an interesting question.
Go ahead,
what is their natural predator back in Asia that we don't have here? And
That's
why
right.
wouldn't they consider bringing it?
They're
it is.
Actually, they're working on that right now. And so let me jump ahead to, there's parasitoid wasps. So those are wasps that lay their eggs in the eggs of other insects. And so there was a parasitoid wasp that was introduced here 20 years ago for gypsy moth. And it was actually found to lay its eggs in spotted lanternfly eggs. And so let me jump ahead to that screen. And so unfortunately, it doesn't hit lanternfly in very high numbers. And so let me go ahead and share my screen back here. But actually, we have colleagues on this who are collaborators on this large grant that I'm leading from the USDA, and they started work immediately in 2014 to go to China to find some of these natural enemies and bring them back. It takes about 10 years because you have to make sure that the timing of the life cycle of those wasps, see, this is one of the wasps, Anastatis, that they're working on. The timing of its life cycle didn't match the timing of that of lanternfly, and they realized there's different subspecies. So they got the other one, they've gotten that into colony at this university, at this USDA high quarantine facility. But also there's one over here, it lays its eggs in the nymphs of lanternfly and eats them from the inside out, and they're making good progress on that. And then there's some fungi. So there certainly are predators that eat them, but these naturally occurring parasitoids and pathogens that have co-evolved with them for millions of years tend to be what keep them in check in their native range. And so unfortunately, the problem here, I'm going to go back to try to get to where I wanted to go here. But the problem is that here, those natural enemies don't exist, but also we tend to not study things before they're a problem, right? So these obscure little wasps that are tiny and lay their eggs in the eggs of other insects, there's no reason for folks to study it in China because it's not a pest in China. And so there's a lot of, rehashing you need to do. There's a lot of fundamental science that has to happen. But that's essentially, in terms of our promise, the long-term solution we're hoping for. So as lanternfly became a problem here, we sought grant money. And so we had some funding, and I'll tell you about what we did with that from Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture and USDA before this grant came through. But because I happen to be an expert in lanternflies in general, and because I knew the folks at Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture prior to coming to Penn State, but also because Penn State has a really strong relationship with Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture, they gave us some money to, hey, help solve this. And so as we were doing that, I led a large grant proposal that didn't get funded the first year, but it got funded the second year. And so I'm the lead PI, and we have overall 37 other researchers and extension folks at all of these other institutions in the region. And so we have a $7.3 million grant, and we had to receive matching funds. It was interesting when I applied for it, I thought, wow, if I had $8 million, I wouldn't need to match it with $8 million. But where we got that was growers allowing us to do research on their land. And that was Penn State, as well as USDA in particular, and Virginia Tech, but all these other institutions, but Virginia Tech and USDA have these strong relationships as well. And so we got over $5 million of in-kind match from growers. And so we have growers as our stakeholder panel that we report to, which is kind of cool. And so the overall objectives of the grant are just figure out immediately what's going to knock it down and communicate it. And that's what we did with the Pennsylvania Department of Ag money before we even got the grant. And the problem with that was lanternflies in quarantine, and where we have our experimental grapes in State College is not under quarantine, where the Fruit Research Extension Center is in Biglerville was not under quarantine. So we had to figure out where, my colleague David Bittinger told me, Julie, I need a place to put 500 potted peach trees and 250 grapes to test insecticides. And I'm like, I'm a molecular biologist. How big are 250 grapes, right? And so we put the call out to the Commonwealth campuses, and our dean was really helpful in organizing this. And Penn State Berks said, hey, you can take some of our turf grass and horticulture plot and make a facility. And so we've continued to do that. We actually have plants in the ground out there. So we tested a big variety of chemicals. We've published that in the literature, but we continue to do updated research. A lot of things kill it, which is kind of good. We have these, a whole variety of fact sheets that are available to different constituencies. The extension, Penn State Extension Spotted Lanternfly site, we've been funded with USDA funds, and we make all of these materials, even the publications, available for other states to put their logos on. So
Julie,
this is like a
let me just
clearinghouse
interrupt for a
things.
second
Yeah.
there. I know that Penn State's leading the charge in Pennsylvania. What about in the country?
Oh yeah, basically we're leading all of these materials. We had a big presentation at our national meeting out in Denver yesterday. And any of these, it takes a lot of marketing to produce these and all of the facts and science that we found. This is made available through our Penn State Extension Communications team to other states to put their logos on it. And they're using this information and pushing it out. And so we're working very collaboratively, not just with those other institutions in my grant, but also because we work so strongly with Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture, they're working with the state's Department of Agriculture for all of these other states. And so I've served on a panel with other folks from my college for California Department of Food and Agriculture. We've been interacting with California since 2018. They funded some of my research. I've been working with folks in New Zealand. So this thing landed in our backyard, so we had to come up with the solutions fastest, and those are the ones that are out there. It costs money to do research, so everybody's kind of using what we found.
So
and so
I'll
just
ask
as,
you to-
yeah,
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah.
You finish.
I'm sorry, how much time?
About 5 minutes.
Okay, perfect. So as a case in point, just in terms of fact sheets that we've produced that get handed out, and this is before COVID, so this isn't counting downloads. These are things that are administered in person. Just the Penn State fact sheets, we've distributed quite a bit. And again, these are all available for other states to use. So we have short-term solutions and ways to communicate that with those fact sheets, but we're essentially buying time for the science to come up with these long-term solutions like the parasitoids, like the natural enemies. And so that's really what we're working on. And so one of the issues here is that, just going to jump ahead, that egg stage is really problematic. They can move around in a long time, but also that adult stage where they feed really voraciously. Those are kind of the two areas I'm focusing on in my research. My student Erica Smyers did some studies where she reared lanternfly in the lab under different temperatures and observed them in the field. And much like plants, if you're familiar with plant hardiness zones, you can look at temperature to predict. And rather than when plants and your tomatoes will get ripe, we can predict when lanternfly eggs will hatch. And even though they're not throughout the country, we use those data to create an actual model that's available on our grant site, stopslf.org. So for folks in Washington who are freaking out because one live showed up, when they want to know, hey, Julie, when should I go out to do surveys? Because I don't have money to do surveys in the spring to see if I have lanternfly. Well, put in your location, and based on temperature for that year, that's going to tell you when those eggs are going to hatch and when you should start looking for them. Similarly, one of the questions, John, that you mentioned, what about reproductive development? This is what I'm doing. They get these pretty little yellow bellies, so they're pretty to me, as they fatten up and the eggs mature. And so I do a lot of imaging, I do a lot of dissection and look at, different stages of development and try to answer when are they most likely to have been mated, when are they at risk for moving, but also, they can lay more than one egg mass. So what does that look like? But also, are there limits on reproductive development? It really takes them a long time to feed enough to start laying eggs. They're adults in the end of July, and they're not starting to lay eggs until really the beginning of October. And so if you think about how warm does it have to be to let the plants live that long to give them the food they need, that might impose limits on where they can get to. And so this is one of those growing degree day maps. Basically, degree days are just kind of arbitrary temperature units, but it looks like, and again, I'm verifying this with dissections, if it takes 2,290 degree days, you have to be exposed to this amount of warmth. That corresponds to, these two aquas look kind of similar, but it looks like you can't persist in these brighter blue areas. Those might be some limits to where a lanternfly can move. But unfortunately, that kind of shows us that even throughout Pennsylvania, it looks like it's still going to be warm enough for them to grow and long enough to reproduce. But those are some of the questions we're trying to answer with our research. I'll just wrap this up. When those mouthparts penetrate the plant tissues, if you run a little electric current through the bug and through the plant, you get a waveform. And basically we can look at this and determine exactly what plant tissues lanternfly are feeding on. And if we give them different host plants or different varieties of grapes, some that they can feed on more easily, and some, of course, they're going to prefer a little bit less, that might allow us to identify some traits that kind of inhibit their feeding to hopefully come up with varieties of grapes or other plants that might be more resistant to lanternfly. And so I'll leave with that. I think that gives you, there's no end to what we're up to.
So are you
That's
hopeful
fascinating.
at this point? Are you hopeful or pessimistic about your efforts? Where are you?
Well, I think that changes daily, frankly, but it kind of was a knock hearing that it's in all 5 boroughs. I do believe that science will come up with the answer. You know, we will be able to manage it, and we will be able to come up with, I think, biological controls for it. I think that there's potentially other, you know, things we can do along these lines of finding crop varieties and that kind of thing. But my concern really is that we're never going to eradicate it. It's always going to be there. And so I think that we just need to deal with how to manage it. And if we can predict when it's going to occur, when it's going to move into different areas, which we're kind of doing now, and if we can really predict what plants it likes versus not, anybody in the audience who has lanternfly, you might have a tree with thousands on them and the same species of tree next to it that don't have any on it. And so if we can predict where it's going to be, then we can just treat those trees. Chemicals knock it down, other things will hit it. And so we just have to fine tune that prediction. And I'm confident we're going to be able to do that.
Julie, there's 2 good questions in the chat. David Vollmer and Harry Barfoot, their 2 questions are kind of overlapping here. They're looking for where is the best place to have the most current up-to-date answers when people have questions. And they're looking for recommendations on specific products that can knock down the eggs or knock down the lanternflies.
And so I would say for both of those answers, the Penn State Extension website. And so there's the names of different products and how long they act is given in the various management guides. And so there's a new, it's the residence guide, right? That's where you got that picture of the plant stressor, Michela, is that correct? There's a new management guide that just came out this spring that is the latest, greatest on lanternfly. And so it includes what the active ingredients are and the names of the compounds and how long they act. And there's actually also, even on one of those fact sheets on the website, kind of like a decision tree for how to treat, because and whether you should treat, because again, one of the things that I'm concerned about is, well, just to state it, the only thing lanternfly has killed outright are grapes and tree of heaven. They're only going to be a stressor on your red maple, your beautiful thing, you know, your beautiful ornamentals. And so I'm hesitant to have people apply pesticides when they don't know if it's going to be a problem. That's also very dangerous. And so deciding, I wouldn't treat until you know whether or not you have a problem.
And why are they not a pest in China? You mentioned earlier you
Yeah.
study bugs when they become a pest, and if they're not, you leave them alone. Why are they not there?
This is kind of true of really any invasive insect, that they there are other natural diseases, predators and enemies that coexist with it that keep it in check. Most things, it's very unusual. Even if we have a native pest where you get an outbreak, it might outbreak, but then other pathogens and things that are present in the area will knock it back down. But here it's like it's released from that. Kind of like, I think we're all familiar with like in Hawaii, a lot of different things get to Hawaii and they go nuts because you know, or even like what anacondas or pythons in the Florida Everglades, right? Whatever eats a python in its native range isn't there in the Florida Everglades. And
Right,
so
right.
that's, you don't have the things that ever keeps everybody in balance.
That makes sense. And Gary asks that we're heading into pruning season, and what do people who are pruning for the winter season do about this?
I would say if you see spotted lanternfly eggs, scrape them. You know, scrape them off, put them in a baggie with hand sanitizer or, you know, rubbing alcohol, something that'll kill it. But also we have found that that's not practical. Like just looking at egg masses alone isn't a practical way to get rid of lanternfly. It can let you manage it. And so oftentimes they're laid way too high up in a tree and we don't want people doing dangerous things. And so I would say scrape what you can get to and then keep an eye out in the spring. And if you see there's different sticky bands or circle traps that are other control options that are available, described on our website. If you use sticky bands, there's please follow the recommendations that keep them thinner or maybe buffer them with some other material that prevent them from catching other wildlife, because if they're too big, they can catch birds, and that's its own problem. But I would say if you happen to notice in the spring that there's a lot of lanternfly on your rose bush, take that opportunity to just knock them down there.
What else can we do on a day-to-day basis? People who may not have big yards, but encounter the lanternfly out on the street or in their normal day-to-day activities on the way to the store or something like that. The top fact sheet that you had was what normal everyday people can do. What are the recommendations?
I mean, there we have this mantra: if you see it, stomp it; if you see it, kill it. And it's not necessarily that we think that, you know, with your hands out there we're gonna take down the populations, but the point of that is to not spread it. And so it's so easy for them. I mean, myself included, they get into your car, they get on the undercarriage, you know, they lay their eggs under your, you know, in your wheel wells. And so pay attention to those, because we don't want you to take them to other areas, because that risk of spread is really where there's a problem. So, so be aware. And if you are in an area, I mean, they're kind of not flying as much now because we've gotten some cold. But if you're ever in an area, you're supposed to check your car before you leave the quarantine zone. But one thing that lanternflies do is they walk up. So if you get in your car and you start driving away before you get out of the quarantine zone, stop after a little bit. And if there's lanternfly that got in your car, any life stage, they're going to crawl up to the windows and up to the roof of your car. So just do that. Then you can take, you know, just like knock them down, you know, kill them, squish them. But again, just be aware so you don't take them to new areas.
Good.
Michela, any closing thoughts?
No, I mean, I just want to mention that, yeah, I mean, for us, our grape industry is concerned, but also is very supportive, and, you know, we keep supporting our industry by buying Pennsylvania wine. You know, it's important to support our industry, because they're working very hard and helping us to figure it out, how to manage this pest. Yeah.
Very good. Julie, final thoughts on your part before we sign off.
I think that, again, the awareness is the important part. The fact that they're not going to kill your plants. So don't make this problem a bigger problem by putting pesticides, you know, and chemicals out in the environment. And they cannot hurt you. That was one myth. They have little sharp tarsi on their feet, and so if they climb up the back of you, which they like to do, it feels like ouch, and people think they're stinging me. I let them try to feed on me. They can't penetrate your skin, so they don't hurt you. And so try to keep your head about you with it. And I think that that's really important.
Well, this has been wonderful. I've learned so much in the last 45 minutes. I feel like we've been following this for 5 or 6 years. In the last 45 minutes, I've learned more in those few minutes than I did the previous 5 or 6 years. So thank you for sharing. Thank you for coming on and participating and cluing us into what happened. We have several really good wineries in the Southeast Pennsylvania area. We do articles on it, but none of us really understood not only the scope of the issue, but what Penn State was doing, not only here in Southeast Pennsylvania, but across the state, as well as the nation, to eradicate this and really understand the spotted lanternfly and eventually eradicate it. So thank you very much for your time. Thank you for participating. Join us again on November 18th when our next NoonZOOM happens with Fred Hubner of Creative Capital Wealth Management, who will be talking to us about investing like the big dogs. Thanks again, and have a good day. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Yes.
You're welcome.